everyone. This is the Santa Barbara City Finance Committee of July 15th, 2008. I'm Council Member Roger Horton. With me is Council Member E.F. Falcone and Council Member Helene Schneider. Today's agenda includes two items: Redevelopment Agency fiscal year interim financials and the interim financials for the city. And so we'll start with the Redevelopment Agency, which is item 16. Mr. Bossi, is that you or Mr. Gustafson?
Yeah, good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Bob Pearson, Finance Director. We will be turning it over to Mr. Bossi in case there are any questions, but as you know, these are the interim financial statements for both the city and the Redevelopment Agency for the month of May, and since that's not a quarter-end month, we really don't have a formal presentation for you. We are here to answer any questions on the statements. We will be back probably in 5 or 6 weeks, thereabouts, with the first look at the year-end interims for June 30. And, of course, at that time we will have a comprehensive report for you, giving you your first look at the year-end results for fiscal year 08. So, okay.
You guys like to make a comment, or do you want to just go to us?
We're happy to answer any questions that you have.
Okay, I have a couple. Ms. Schneider.
I just wanted to ask about the Anapamu open space, the Jardín des Granadas. I know it was supposed to be done theoretically by the end of the fiscal year, but I know there's a lot of construction. If you could just give an update, that would be helpful.
Sure, Council Member Schneider would be happy to. Right now, we are finishing up with the sidewalk work on the frontage of Anapamu as well as the Coffee Cat Paseo area. And once that's completed, we'll move into you say it a whole lot better than I do, the Jardín de las Granadas. And depending on how that approaches with Fiesta coming, we'd like to not get started before Fiesta just because it's a very heavy use area and we don't want to impact that anymore. So we'll likely start right after Fiesta and take about a little over a month to complete, and then that will be it for that block forever.
On page 1 of our report, which is the RDA General Fund, I was just noticing that the revenue as of May 31 is sitting at 105.18%, which is pretty good. Do we know what's going on there?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I was actually looking at this and going to make a comment on that. I'm glad you brought it up. If you look at the property tax, the incremental property tax, the first line, you see that the annual budget's about $13.8 million, and through May, we've already received $14.3, so that's 103% of the budget through May, and we still, in the June month-end report, you will see that we actually received some final cleanup payments from the county in the month of June. So we're probably going to end up the year at about 105%, which, given the trauma in the real estate market, is not too bad for us for this year. So pleased to report that it's still looking like we we'll continue to be able to make our budget estimates for property tax. Certainly this year, as you can see, we're over it already, and again for the new fiscal year, FY09.
The other question I had for one of you folks is the investment income line. Seems strange that we'd be doing that much better.
Mr. Chair, in large measure, that's because we've had more cash balances throughout the year than we anticipated in terms of large expenditures. The debt service gets paid, obviously, like clockwork, but other than that, the cash balances have run higher than we expected. And LAIF, which is where all of the RDA's money is invested, has actually, the rate of return on LAIF has actually held up in the face of the declining interest rate environment much better than we expected it would. So, in fact, we just got the LAIF interest rate for the quarter ended June 30, and it's 3.11%, which isn't really all that bad, and that's considering that the end of this fiscal year, But over the course of the fiscal year, life really was slower to decline in this interest rate environment than we anticipated. That, combined with higher cash balances than we anticipated, led to a substantial, almost doubling of our investment income estimate.
Well, we'll count our blessings. Okay, I have no further questions. Anybody else? Is there a motion?
I'll move this to the consent calendar.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. All right. Thank you, guys. The next item, I think, is item number 5.
Yeah. And once again, as Mr. Pearson indicated, we are here on the regular monthly one to answer any questions that you may have. Don't have a presentation on this specifically, but we're happy to field any questions that you've got.
Go ahead.
My question, not particularly on the percentages or anything here, just because it's the 11 months and we've just been through the budget, but more on looking in the future and hearing more and more from Sacramento about a potential loan through Proposition 1A of taking funds out even from the general fund. And I don't know if you have any more information, but I thought it'd be a good chance to bring up what we know up to now. It's all part of the budget process, but if you could comment on that, that would be helpful.
Certainly, Committee Member Schneider, Mr. Chair. As you know, Proposition 1A, which was passed overwhelmingly by the voters of the state of California to protect local government revenues from takings by the state to solve their budget problems, which had been an unfortunate pattern in the past. But with the approval of Proposition 1A, it certainly restricted the state's ability to do that while still leaving them the ability under certain dire circumstances to dip into our property tax revenues. And one could argue, I think maybe some people in Sacramento are arguing from what I hear, that this is certainly that kind of dire circumstance. Under Proposition 1A, they are allowed to take up to 8% of all non-school property tax in each county. And in fact, I looked at that this morning, and depending on how they measure our property tax, that 8% loss to us, should this happen, could be anywhere from about $1.3 to $2.2 million of our property tax revenue. Now, under Proposition 1A, it's a loan. They cannot just take it. They have to repay it with interest, and they have to repay it within 3 years. So there is some question as to how, from an accounting standpoint, that might be treated. Certainly, we would book a receivable for it, and possibly revenue or a deferred revenue. But they do have to repay it within 3 years. 8% on a countywide basis of all non-school property tax. Proposition 1A was silent as to how that 8% would be allocated among the various taxing jurisdictions within a given county, but I've just assumed, at least for the time being, that it would be pro rata, so that every non-school property tax receiving entity within the county would lose 8% were they to take it all, the maximum allowed under Prop 1A. There certainly is, as committee members and people who follow what's going on in Sacramento, you may have a better feel for this than I, but I'm certainly hearing that there's talk going on in Sacramento about triggering the Prop 1A. It would require an emergency declaration by the governor, and it's not the same fiscal emergency declaration that he issued back in, I think, January. It's a separate one just for Prop 1A. And then it would take a 2/3 vote of both houses of the legislature, the Assembly and the Senate, in order to do that. So we'll wait and see. Given the relatively short repayment period provided for in Prop 1A, and given the fact that they can't retake any property tax money from us until and unless they've repaid the first batch, certainly given a 3-year repayment period, if they were to stick to that, do we want to lose that money temporarily? Of course not, but it certainly is something that we're in a position to weather should it happen. I think we'd be lobbying heavily to get them to avoid doing that. But
Thank you. I think there's been newspaper articles and emails flying around, and so just to try to get our sense of where things are at the moment, and I'm sure it'll change, is helpful. So thank you.
Okay. Rudy, page 1, summary by fund.
Yes.
Downtown parking, 64%, and we have a pretty large encumbrance sitting in there.
Yeah.
Since we're now halfway through July, do we think that's going to actually get spent one of these days, or?
Well, the issue with the downtown parking is we don't have a separate capital fund for the downtown parking
Okay.
as we do with other enterprise funds, and a lot of this is actually long-term, multi-year capital projects that they have, and so it won't be fully spent this year.
Okay, we actually have talked about this a couple times.
Right.
I think, had we not suggested that we look into a different way of budgeting for this, Mr. Pearson and Rudy?
Yeah, we've actually had discussions about that, and we're looking at that, and probably for the next fiscal year, we will be setting up another fund
Okay.
that we'll have for the capital in there. It makes sense.
It's part of the next 2-year financial plan.
Yeah.
Because the water fund, the wastewater fund, airport, waterfront fund, they all have separate capital funds, which really allows us to break out the capital projects, which, as Rudy says, have multi-year horizons, and allows for a much more realistic comparison of operating budget. And we will do that as part of the next 2-year financial plan for the parking fund as well.
Ms. Falcone?
Well, I'd just like to lend my 2 cents in support of this idea, because over the years there have been a number of various different entities and agendas that have come after what looks like a large chunk of unappropriated monies in the downtown parking fund, and then we have to go through this discussion and exercise every time about, well, no, it's for capital and so forth, and so I think it just really calls, if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck, then we should give it a little home and call it a duck. And that way nobody is confused about, well, what should go over here for transit and what should go over here for, it's just really set out and it's much clearer. So I appreciate that we're going to do that, because I've already had these conversations several times, and they're frustrating because people, get, the downtown parking committee gets very unnerved that suddenly they won't have the funds to be able to, for political reasons, they won't have the funds to be able to fix their buildings. And that's absolutely critical capital that we keep maintained. So thank you.
Okay, so
Mr. Chair, if I might, if you'd look at page 11 of your report, there's a separate page on the downtown parking fund, and you can see at the bottom of the expense section, the next to bottom line, the capital fixed assets budget and what's still available and the encumbrance and all of that. So that's a little bit more detailed look of what we're talking about that would be broken out into a separate fund.
all right. So, Rudy, next time I ask that question, you can say, remember, we already talked about that.
Oh, no
Several
problem.
times. I have one other one on page 9 under this is water operating fund revenues.
Yes.
And again, I note several have exceeded the annual budget, although not all.
That's correct.
Already. And for example, service charges, investment income, grants, and so on. Do you have any comments on what to expect at the end of the year on that?
Well, in the water operating fund, they're obviously going to be over budget on the revenues. It's that catch-22. You get more revenues because it's dry, but then we also need that water, so that's where we're at here. And really, that's it. The issue with the Decatur JPA treatment charges is we actually bill Carpinteria and Montecito for their share of certain expenses, and when we have higher expenses in there, then they have to pay a higher portion, and that's why that one's running ahead also. And the investment income, we've seen that across the board. Part of that throughout all the different funds. Part of that is cash balances, as Mr. Pearson talked about, but it's also, we have some of the budgets were fairly conservative in that line also, so that comes into play. The one thing that I wanted to notice, there is one that is significantly under the budget, and that's that miscellaneous revenues, and that's a timing issue, because part of the loans that we have to pay on the water bonds or the the debt that we have there is reimbursed by Cater, by the participants in the Cater project, and I don't believe that we have received all of that payment. It comes in different billings, and we are lagging there on one of those, it appears, and so that should be trued up by the end of the year.
Yeah.
I'm the liaison to the Water Commission, and we had a meeting yesterday, so this information is very fresh. And it is true that the water usage is up from past years. Now, there's a point in time from the drought that we measure, and we have never gotten quite back up to that point yet, but it's creeping more closely to that line. And the bottom line is that water usage overall is going up. And that's attributed to some extent to the fact that it's dry. It's also attributed to the fact that there's a couple of other things going on, exploration and things, technical things. But that's reflected here. You'll see specifically that reflection in what you just talked about.
Very good. I have no further questions. Anyone else? If not, is there a motion?
I'll move it to consent calendar.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. I believe that concludes our agenda for today, and thank you for being here, and thanks everyone for watching.